for that, I think I motivated already quite well. So we, based on the output of this estimation, you run it on a whole project and you see, 30% of sentences are translated perfectly or near perfectly. Well, that means your translators won't have as much to do. So you can decide to use the MT for this project, and you can also predict that you will be able to translate the document more cheaply. And also, when you're producing the translations, when you're working in the editor, you will see that this sentence is near perfect machine translation. Maybe you should really look at it and try to make only the necessary changes. And if you see that the translation probably is not good, you might decide to skip it and translate from scratch. So at this moment we support something like a little over 70 language pairs. The feature is agnostic to MD engine, so whatever Google Translate, Microsoft, or your custom engine, it will work. It's currently in a beta version, but already we know that we will need to do more. This is the last point going forward. We don't want to focus just on the perfect or near perfect NT, because that's really just a relatively small percentage of cases. But we also want to show translators which segments are good for post-editing. So good MT or high quality MT overall is something we're planning for the next version coming out very soon. I want to say that in terms of machine learning that you require for this, this is actually a more difficult problem, so you need more powerful machine learning models to do this. And this is a chart to sort of illustrate that these things make sense, that they are useful for translators. So what I'm plotting here is for a handful of language pairs, the ratio of segments which are either non-translatable or which have very good, very high quality machine translation. So of all the sentences that come through our Memsource cloud, for example, let's have a look at English-Russian, we can see that around, maybe almost 10% of them are non-translatable, and if we can detect that, we can save some amount of time and money for translators and the translation companies. And then there is also some percentage of perfect or near perfect machine translations. If we can detect that, we can, save some more money and maybe help the translation agency that uses Memsource be a little bit more competitive. So these features, even though they look quite simple, especially the non-translatable seems so almost obvious thing to do, it's actually useful. And as a last point, I would like to say something a little bit about going forward in the automation area. We know that the project management is a time-consuming job, and there's a lot of tasks which are quite repetitive. For example, as a project manager, when a job comes in, I might have to assign some translators, some linguists, suitable for this job based on their expertise with this domain, experience, for example, with this particular client, and things like that. The same goes for attaching other resources, such as translation memories or terminology bases. And we think that if we understood the content better, we could automate some of these, or at least provide hints, so that the project managers spend less time basically navigating a complicated user interface and deciding who to assign to what. We can just help them out. And I think really the key is to understand. If we can somehow see that the job that comes in, the content is somehow similar to things that the translation agency has handled in the past, maybe we can assign linguists who work on those similar jobs. We can assign terminology bases that were assigned to these projects previously that share the same content. And so I think this is something that's going on overall in the industry, and we're also trying to move forward on this. And I think actually these tasks, once we solve them to some extent, it's really just the first step to even more automation in the industry. And again, this is not Memsource specific. I think there's a lot of movement like that overall. So to conclude, we think that AI or machine learning in translation is not just machine translation. It's all these novel, interesting features that you can develop when you sort of take a step back and you try to find all the places, all the areas where machine learning can be useful. I think this is even a sort of a lesson that goes beyond the translation industry, and that's if you already have a product as a company that works, and ideally it's a software product or something that can be automated, if you already have that product and you have a user base, you can look at machine learning and ways how it can enhance your product, how to make it more efficient, more user-friendly. I don't think it makes really sense to go from no product to something that's completely oriented towards machine learning or AI, because there's a lot of AI expertise in the world, so your product will not be unique. But once you already have a product, you can keep making it maybe a little bit more friendly and efficient by thinking about machine learning. And yeah, I would like to reiterate really that the translation industry is ever moving faster and faster to automating every step of the translation workflow. That's it from me. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer a few questions. So if you have, yeah, please. Do you have a question? Anybody just shout if you have a question.
First of all, back in past in statistical machine translation, we needed a big data, right? A pile of data for the machine to produce an output, to align the sentence, right?
Yes.
And now in normal machine translation, we need big data again, and noisy data, or rather clearer data in perception of less is more.
Yes, so this is a complex question. You still need lots of data, but some researchers, or there is some indication in research that noise hurts neural networks more than it hurts statistical MT. So cleaning the data may be a worthwhile investment, but I think still the sort of conventional wisdom that's been around, there is no better data than more data. That still holds. If you can get your hands on more data, then just use that.
And the last question is, can we say that we made progress in these 2 years than we have been making since the last decade in terms of machine translation?
Yes, I think so. There was a big sort of generation of research focused on the statistical methods, such as phrase-based MT, hierarchical MT, all sort of syntactic statistical-based MT. And we've learned a lot about language and a lot about what works, what sort of information it makes sense to add to the models, and what maybe doesn't work. So I think there's a lot of expertise that we gained from researching that, and we can carry that over to neural networks. But in terms of the qualitative jump in the translation outputs, there is, of course, a major jump now that we haven't seen in maybe 10 years or even longer.
Thank you.
Hello and welcome. So you said that Hello again, sorry. So you said that you were developing different models for each language pair in MT, and I was wondering, can you maybe a little elaborate on that? Is it more of an algorithm-oriented, or maybe you are working linguists for each language pair in a linguistic way?
So this is the point where neural networks really revolutionized the field, because you really don't need to know anything about anything these days. You just throw the data at it and let the algorithm figure it out for itself. So we're actually using fairly similar architectures and model parameters for all the language pairs. We just have to make sure that we pre-process, for example, Chinese or Arabic, languages have with some non-standard scripts in some way that the network can cope with. but really there is a minimal amount of language-specific engineering. The model is language-specific, but the knowledge that we need to give to the model is just data.
Okay, thank you.
Hello.
I wonder the quality of English to Turkish or Turkish to English in machine translation because I didn't saw the Turkish language in your in the graphics.
Right, so, I mean, we don't really develop machine translation ourselves, so we're just providing machine translation from third parties as a service. So I cannot comment on the overall quality of English, Turkish, English, MT. I don't know it out of top of my head. But for the models that we develop, I think we do support either, I think actually both language directions for Turkish. And yeah, the performance of the model is, I think, roughly comparable. For the tasks that I illustrated, the quality estimation and the non-translatable, roughly comparable to other language pairs.
Mr. Tamchyna, thank you so much for your speech. Can we hold you for a second on the floor, please?
We would like to invite our Vice Rector, Professor Ergül Berber, to present Mr. Tamchyna's plaque.
And now, we're moving on to our keynote address. Before we invite our keynote speaker to the floor, we would like to inform you about his background. Professor Mikel Forcada graduated in science in 1986 and got his PhD in chemistry in 1991. Since 2002, he is a full professor of computer languages and systems at the University of Alicante. Professor Forcada is the president of the European Association for Machine Translation since 2015 and the president of the Project Management Committee of the free open source machine translation platform Arçev. Since 2000, Professor Forcada's interests have mainly focused on the field of translation technologies, but he has worked in fields as diverse as quantum chemistry, biotechnology, surface physics, machine learning, especially with neural networks, and also meta theory. He is the author of more than 70 articles in international journals, papers in international conferences, and book chapters, 40 of which are about translation technologies. As the keynote speaker, we are honored to invite Professor Mikel Forcada to the floor for his keynote speech. Please welcome.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me. Well, to get the presentation ready, I'm honored to be here, and I hope my talk is useful. So, prepare. You will have questions. Prepare questions, and make sure that you get the most from this and from the discussion after that. So I'm going to be talking about new machine translation technologies in the translation workstation. Some of the material that I have in this talk has already been covered by Alice, so it would be easier for me. As you can see, I'm also a member of a small company called Promsit. We founded a small language engineering company too, so I talk to people in the industry. You have to excuse me because I have a cold, so I sometimes will have to use this. Okay. So the outline of my talk, I will cover machine translation for professionals, then talk about general purpose versus special purpose MT, then machine translation technologies. In particular, we'll be talking a bit about neural machine translation. And I'm going to be talking about machine translation and computer-aided translation, the traditional way and other possible new uses, and end with some concluding remarks. So machine translation. We all know what machine translation is. It's translation by means of a computer using suitable software of a text that is in the source language and produces a text in the target language, more or less, which we can call a raw translation. Black box. Well, actually white here. Yeah. For many of us, machine translation is a box. You throw text in, you get text out. No human intervention, which means not yet human intervention. Okay? So, is this raw translation really a translation? Usually, machine translation, generally, cannot be used as a professional product would. So, most of the times, you find out that machine translation and professional translation, even if they are closely related in purpose, they're not interchangeable. For example, most of the times, except for some minor percentage, machine translation output cannot be used as is. And this does not mean that machine translation is useless. In fact, this fact of this complementarity between machine translation and professional translation was already recognized very long ago by J.C. Sager when he said that there is no single situation in which machine translation and human or professional translation are equally suitable. So we're in for collaboration.